Hello, and thank you for joining me on this short video on effective studying. I'm Dr. Rebecca Wilson, and I help students develop their potential at the University of St Andrews and develop their academic and professional skills. And one thing that I really enjoy working on is thinking about how we learn and how we approach studying. And so today we're going to be looking very briefly at some cognitive science. And I'm not a cognitive scientist, but we're going to be using this science and the experience that I've gained working with students to develop their study skills to think about how you can study more effectively. So what happens a lot of the time when we are studying is that we don't critically think about how we learn. Instead, we just open up the textbook, we start the assignment without really thinking about how we are undertaking this task. I think a nice analogy when we are thinking about learning and studying is if you were to think about the room that you're in now and if you were to paint it. You'd think about how you'd approach the task. So for the bigger walls, you might use a roller. For intricate details around windowsills, you would probably use a smaller brush. And again, different areas of the room might get different tools. This is how we should be approaching our learning. We should think about how we learn, what is the most effective way of doing so. However, quite often this is not what has happened, and there's been a lot of research into this. And one example I'm sharing with you now was a study done of undergraduate students in the US, although my personal experience has seen this is very true at St Andrews as well. And I can share the references to this in a separate document attached to the Moodle page. So when we look at this, when we think about what the most common study techniques are, you can see that number one is rereading notes or textbooks. From working with students, and certainly from my own experience studying, this is a really common thing to do. And quite often it feels like we are doing a lot of work when we do this. You can spend hours at the library reading and rereading notes, and especially the idea is here that we are rereading and we think that we're going to learn from that, and it feels like it's very productive. But unfortunately, that's not really the case, and we'll go why and how it's not going to be that effective in a bit more detail later. Another one that's quite high up is rewriting notes. And you can see that these two areas make up quite a large proportion of students who use this as their number one strategy. So 67% of students who are asked in this survey, their primary way of studying is thinking about rereading or rewriting notes. And this isn't great because this is what we call passive learning. And so we're going to go into passive learning and active learning, but the idea here is that quite often the most common study techniques aren't the most useful. And in order to think about why they're not that useful, we need to think very briefly about cognitive science. And we're not going to go into too much detail into this, but the main thing to think about is firstly what cognitive science is. And this is the study of how the mind works, how we perceive, how we think, and how we remember. And what's important for learning is really thinking about how we remember and how information is not just perceived or received, but how it's processed and how it's stored in the long-term memory. And quite importantly, how we retrieve that information from the long-term memory. Of course, retrieving information from your long-term memory is going to be very important in a traditional exam setting, but even for writing assignments, for building on that knowledge in the future, if you can get information into your long-term memory, it's going to be much more useful. You're not going to have to relearn it. And more important for building on this is that you'll already have the foundation there. Once information is in your long-term memory as well, you can use it, you can analyze it, you can be more creative rather than trying to simply retain the information. And to think about how we get this new information into our long-term memory, we need to think about how we take in information. So we're constantly collecting information from our senses, and we're getting a lot of stimulus. Then once we use this information, it goes into our working memory, so we have to acknowledge it almost. We'll take in a lot of information that never really gets acknowledged. For example, you might have a set of stairs in your house or your apartment. The likelihood is that when you go up to the stairs to get to your front door or to get to a different store in your house, you couldn't tell me right now how many stairs there are, but when you're climbing them, your brain will be counting so that you don't fall over. This isn't going to your working memory. We then have to do something to get to your working memory. We have to acknowledge it. And then furthermore, this working memory only has a very limited capacity, and you need to process it and keep it fresh, and then it will move into your long-term memory. In order to get it into your long-term memory, you need to encode that information, and the conditions have to be right for this. So you want to think about, how can I get this information from my working memory into my long-term memory? And that's something that we're going to sort of unpick and give very practical examples of in the remainder of this presentation. So we're thinking about how to get information into our long-term memory. And in other words, what are the most effective study techniques? What can I do to make sure that I'm retaining this information? And what good habits can I get to make sure that I'm studying smart and not just spending hours of doing things that maybe aren't that helpful? And according to scientists, there are 5 key things that we can do. The first one of these is retrieval practice, and I personally think this is the most useful. So this is the idea of testing yourself. We've then got distributed and interleaved practice. So this is the idea that you're going to mix up your studying and do it regularly. Dual coding, so thinking about how we take in information and trying to get that in more than one way, and thinking about using examples and example. And then finally thinking about elaboration and examples. I'm going to unpick these briefly. You might first be asking me though, okay, so I've been studying all my life, I've got quite good grades, or why aren't we already doing these? It might be that some people are, but there are studies that show only 1 in 4 students will use effective learning strategies. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the main ones is not being aware of the good strategies. It might be that you've not been taught them at school, or that you've got into old habits. And that's another reason, that old habits do die hard, and it is quite hard to break these once you are used to just rereading information. Another reason is what I'm going to show you does take some time and organisation, which is hard to get into. What I would say is that once you do, it might take you less time. So it's more about planning what you're going to do, and then maybe the information should take less time for you to remember. And the final one is something called the illusion of competence. So a lot of people aren't using effective study techniques because of this illusion of competence. And this is the idea that we are not very good sometimes at judging our own learning, and that our predicted performance or predicted of understanding and our actual performance are different, and we really overestimate our future memory. So if you think about that, you are rereading a text, you think this is really familiar, or you're rereading your lecture notes, this is really familiar, I already know this, I know this is in my long-term memory. But quite often it is not. It just feels like it is because it is familiar and it's comfortable. But there's a difference between something being familiar and you knowing it. And so when we are doing this, it feels good. It feels like we know what we're talking about, but maybe we're being overconfident. And that's why these techniques are really useful, particularly retrieval practice, because you'll soon realise what you do and do not know. So we're going to think about how to study effectively, and that's what we're going to talk about for the next section of this, and really think about some practical examples. So I've already mentioned passive learning. We've spoke about reading, and here are particularly, so you're all going to have to read a lot for your degree, that just reading or rereading information, copying it word for word, isn't going to get that information into your long-term memory. Another one is highlighting. Quite often we think of highlighting as something that would be more active, but what happens is normally we'll highlight long amounts of information and never really use that information. So instead, what we want to try and engage in is active learning. And you can see from my active PowerPoint, this is what we are trying to encourage. And there's some ways about thinking of active learning. The first one is thinking. So we want to be processing that information. In order to encode it, we want to do something with it. So rather than just copying information, maybe you'll be selecting key bits. And this really links into questioning. So thinking about why you're reading this, maybe what's the most important message this journal article is giving you. Maybe thinking about how this chapter or how this lecture or how your results in your lab are different or the same as something that you have previously learned. Reorganising is a very effective way of studying effectively, in terms of it's quite minimal effort for quite a large output. For example, rather than just taking a lot of notes, you could rearrange the notes. Maybe you have a list of something chronologically. Instead of doing it chronologically, you could do it by different themes. Again, you're processing this information, and that's what you want to do. And finally, retrieving, so testing yourself. This doesn't necessarily have to be in a very formal setting, and it's best that it's not. It could simply be covering up a page that you've just read and trying to remember as much as you can from it. The more you test yourself, the easier it is going to be. And instead of just doing passive learning, it's very unlikely you're going to remember something from just reading and copying it. A very small proportion of the population can do this, but you'll be very lucky if you can, and it's normal that you're going to have to engage in active learning, which, to be honest, is probably far more interesting to do. So we're going to break down these 5 key areas that I highlighted at the start. And the first, and I said what I think is the most important, is retrieval practice. And there's extensive research showing the importance of retrieval learning. And even doing one practice test can produce a large improvement in a final exam. And this is really altering how you perceive and thinking about the cues that you have. So if you were to go into your kitchen now, maybe there's a spice that maybe you know where your salt and pepper are because you retrieve them all the time, you get them quite often. Maybe there's a spice that you don't use very often, some cinnamon in the back of your cupboard. It would take you a lot longer to find because you're not used to getting it. And that's what you need to think of. You need to think, how can I quickly get this? How can I retrieve it? And every time you do that, it's going to be easier for you in the future. Quite often we think of testing as a bad thing, but instead think of it as just practicing retrieving this new knowledge. And with all active learning, this requires cognitive effort. You can't just be mindless. I know that from when I was studying in the past, sometimes I'd completely zone out, but I'd read 2 pages of information. I couldn't have told you what them pages said. And as well as taking lots of breaks and being effective in time management, which you can learn about in a separate lecture, it's really important that testing yourself is going to make you more aware, and sort of this engagement is a really good thing. This isn't new though. We've known for a long time that testing ourselves is a really important thing to do. And this quote is actually from Aristotle. So when you're beginning to learn, think about how you can do this, and what's the most effective way of doing that. Here are some really easy examples that you can think of. Past papers. So these are available online, and you can email if you don't know how to get them. But if you don't have past papers, or maybe that you've already done the ones that you do have, make some up for your friends. Think about any questions that could come up, maybe in tutorials or lectures. You've had practice questions or questions of the week. Make sure that you're doing this. And this comes into planned and timed answers. So it's not necessary that you have to do the entire paper. Maybe it was a 3-hour exam. You don't have to do that. You can plan them, and this can be just as useful. So maybe give yourself 10 minutes to plan what you would put in this area. And this can be really useful, and particularly giving yourself a timed element and then going back and checking to see if you've added, if you missed anything, if you need to add anything to it. So taking all your notes away, planning a question for 10 minutes, thinking everything that you can for that answer, and then going back to your notes, going back to your lectures and your textbooks and seeing what else you've missed. Chunking is a really useful tool. And this is just where we separate information out. So rather than trying to remember maybe 30 different types of drugs, if you are a medicine student thinking in pharmacology, right, how can I separate these drugs into maybe 5 different sections? It might be that they're to do with different health issues, and do it that way. Therefore, you're no longer having to remember a larger amount, but a smaller amount. You're reorganizing the information, which is important. And the final one is that I'm sure a lot of you will be already using is flashcards. When you use flashcards, you want to make sure that you're actually testing yourself and not just reading them. Ideally, you'll be doing this out loud. So you want something that will cue your memory. Maybe it's a question, maybe it's a formula on one side of the card, and the other side of the card, you'll have a small amount of information that you need to remember. This is even better, as I said, if you can say it out loud, then you'll really know if you're testing yourself, or write it down and then test it. If you can get a friend to test you, even better if you've got the same flashcards, or there is a lot of apps that you can use to do this. So speaking out loud, writing it down, making sure that you are really testing yourself, and doing the cards in different orders every time you do them. And I'll come to why this is important in a second. The main thing with the retrieval practice, though, is to make sure that you're doing it, and you're doing it regularly. It can be quite scary to think, oh, I've got to keep testing myself, but building this into how you study is really important. So I said it was important to mix up the order of your flashcards, and that's because another part of effective studying is thinking about distributed and interleaved practice. So distributed practice is the idea that we implement a schedule of practice that spreads out the study activities over time. So instead of cramming information in at once, we're going to do this over several days, weeks, and months. And then interleaved practice is implementing a schedule of practice that mixes different kinds of problems, or a schedule of study that mixes different kinds of materials within a single study session. So again, rather than just doing a big chunk of the same thing, you're going to mix this up. So for example, if you think about when you were younger and were at school, rather than just doing learning all multiplications when you're in math lessons, and then doing all spelling when you were in English, the idea is that when you were in doing math lessons, maybe you would do 15 minutes of multiplication and then 15 minutes of division. And then when you were doing English, you might do 15 minutes of spelling and then 15 minutes of reading. And then it's important that next time you study, you would do this in a different order. And changing the order is also important. If you think about if you've got a favourite playlist, quite often when I'm listening to my playlist and I listen to them in the same order, I know what song is coming next before it starts playing. And maybe if the order changes, your brain will notice. And so you want your brain to notice, you want to engage in that cognitive effort and be active in your learning. So this is a really important graph that brings together both retrieval practice, distributed and interleaved practice. So you can see that we forget about 75% of information after 10 minutes of learning it. So you think that you've took information in, you've been rereading your notes, you've been copying them out, but 10 minutes later you will have forgotten the vast majority of that. However, look at what happens if you review that a day after, a week after, and a month after. You're far more likely to remember it. So looking at something once for 2 hours in a week isn't that effective. Instead, what we want to do is, instead of doing that 2 hours in one block, to split that block 2 hours up and maybe do an hour and then half an hour, 15 minutes, and keep going back to that information. So we want to do this regularly, and we want to mix up our practice. So thinking about this, you need to have a timetable and be organised, which does take quite a lot of work. So I'd say the best thing to do is to start off a big list. Think about what you will need to cover and how you will need to cover it. And again, it might be that for your biology studying, that you're going to do some mind maps, but for psychology, that you're going to do flashcards and write notes. So trying to do different activities for different subjects, making it more interesting for you, and doing this distributed and interleaved practice. And try not block it. So not one day on medieval history and the next day on IR. Try and think, okay, right, on Monday at 9 till 11, I'm going to do medieval history. I'm going to have a break, and then I'm going to do international relations. And again, trying to do it regularly. So maybe you'll do a small amount each day, and that you'll be mixing it up. You'll be doing different activities. So just to make this clear, instead of having one big block like this, 1-2 hours, you're going to have smaller half an hour chunks. And you're going to try and do these in different orders each time you look at them. So for history, perhaps maybe you've got key dates, key people, you do a timeline, you do a past paper, and you do a review. And that might be your 2-hour study session. The next time you do that, you're going to split it up and do it in a different order. And although this seems like more effort now, actually, in the long term, it probably means that you won't need to relearn it. And a good way of thinking about this is if you've got a key idea or topic, you're going to do it a lot of detail a day later. So maybe once you've got your lecture, you're going to do a lecture full sort of list of lecture notes, maybe bringing in the key reading for that. And then a week later, maybe you'll consolidate a lot of your lectures. So if you've got 3 lectures that week, you'll be looking at all 3 lectures together and reviewing them. And then a month later, you'll be reviewing all your weekly reviews. So you don't have to go into as much detail every time you do it. But the idea is that you're going to keep building on that knowledge and keep reviewing it. We're now going to move on to another one of these key ideas, which is dual coding. And I won't be going into as much detail as this as the other ones. But dual coding is really what it sounds like. So it's the idea that we're taking in different bits of information. And we're not just having words or pictures or sounds, but we're having at least 2. And this is a really nice way to revise or to study or to try and learn more effectively. And a clear way of this is thinking about visualization and words. So here you've got a diagram of DNA, and then you've got some notes on DNA. And so what's important here is that you can do both. So maybe you've got a diagram in your textbook, a timeline, something like that, and you can write it out in your own words. Or it might be that you have text, and that's more likely, and then you can draw this, which is a really nice way of being active again in your learning. So maybe you could draw a flowchart of the key arguments in a chapter that you are reading, or maybe you will draw the main thinkers in the area that you're studying in. In science, there is a lot of examples of diagrams. You can turn these into words and again, flip them back. And our final one is looking at elaboration and examples. And so when we elaborate, we think about how we can link to more nodes. And nodes are what makes your long-term memory work. So the more elaboration you have, the easier it is going to be for you to remember. And this really engages into deeper learning. And particularly if you can make it personal and concrete, because your memory likes to hook onto concrete things rather than abstract things. And we'll go into a bit more detail of this. So an example of an abstract idea is that a palindrome is a word, number or phrase that has a sequence of characters which read the same forward as they do backwards, or backwards as they do forwards. This is quite an abstract concept, but how I remember palindrome, which is making it concrete and personal, is that I have a friend or pal named Hannah who studies drones. And so obviously it sounds a bit like palindrome, and this is how I remember it. And to do some dual coding, then I think of a picture of a drone. Maybe an easier example to understand is the idea of scarcity. So scarcity, as you might know, is the idea that the rarer something is, the higher its value. But a concrete example of this is that tickets are more expensive nearer an event. So when you're reading quite theoretical understandings, quite abstract ideas, which is what happens at a university, think about how you can make them more concrete. Think about how they impact you. Think about the examples in the real world, and you're more likely to remember them. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation about studying effectively. There are a lot more resources on this page, and I'll put some links below into more ideas. And please get in touch if you got any questions and that you want some further help with anything we've been talking about today.